There is a moment right before sleep when your thoughts become loud enough to feel like they are controlling your entire life. This message is reaching you exactly there, not in the middle of a busy day, not when you are distracted, but in that quiet space where money worries feel heavier, the future feels uncertain, and your mind refuses to slow down no matter how tired you are. There is something you were never properly told about this moment. Something simple yet powerful enough to change the way your nights unfold and the way your life responds afterward. Most people miss it completely, even though they pass through it every single night. And tonight that changes for you, because there is a deeper process happening while you are lying there thinking, replaying, stressing, and trying to fix everything in your head. It is not random, it is not meaningless, it is shaping something you cannot yet see. But before this goes further, stay with this, because what comes next will completely change how you see your nights and the way your reality begins to respond to you. Most people will never hear this, not because it is hidden, but because they stop too soon. They assume sleep is only rest. They assume thoughts at night are harmless. They assume the mind is just tired noise that fades away in the morning. That assumption is where everything quietly goes wrong. There is a reason some people wake up feeling heavier, and others wake up with a strange sense that something is shifting in their life, even before anything outside has changed. It is not luck, it is not coincidence, it is something far more consistent and far more subtle. And it begins the moment you stop fighting the night and start understanding what it is actually doing to you. Because sleep is not an escape from reality. It is where reality begins to reorganize around what you repeatedly feel when the world is silent. There is a state you enter every night that most people ignore completely. A state where your emotional frequency becomes louder than logic. A state where your sense of lack or safety quietly programs how tomorrow will feel, long before tomorrow arrives. And tonight you are going to understand how to step out of stress without forcing it, how to relax into a different inner experience that does not depend on fixing your life first, and how a simple shift in feeling before sleep can begin changing the way your outer world responds over time. Not through effort, but through alignment. And if you stay until the end, something inside you will stop feeling like it is constantly chasing life, and start feeling like life is finally beginning to meet you differently. Welcome to the channel. If this message finds you at the right time, consider subscribing, because what follows here is not just information, it is a different way of experiencing your nights and your reality. There is a reason your mind suddenly becomes the loudest right when the world becomes quiet. At night, even small thoughts start to feel heavy. A simple concern about money turns into a full future story. A small mistake from the day turns into regret. A minor uncertainty becomes something your mind tries to solve as if it is an emergency. Do not skip this part, because this is where most people make the biggest mistake. They believe something is wrong with them. But there is a lesser known truth about the human brain that explains this clearly. Neuroscientists have found that when external stimulation decreases, the brain does not actually slow down. It increases internal activity in areas connected to memory, prediction, and emotional processing. In simple terms, when the world gets quiet, your mind starts working overtime inside itself. This is why nights feel heavier than days. It is not because your life becomes worse. It is because your brain finally has space to process everything it ignored while you were busy surviving the day. And that is where the struggle begins. Because your mind is not trying to harm you, it is trying to help you. It believes it is solving your life. It replays conversations, predicts outcomes, and searches for control. But it is doing this at the exact moment when you are the most tired and least capable of handling emotional weight. So everything feels bigger than it actually is. And here is something important you may not realize yet. Emotional exhaustion does not always feel like sadness. Sometimes it feels like overthinking. Sometimes it feels like restlessness. Sometimes it feels like your mind refusing to shut down even when your body is begging for sleep. That is not weakness. That is overload. And here is the truth nobody says out loud. You were never broken. You were never lost. You were always exactly where you needed to be. You are simply carrying too much at once, and night removes every distraction that normally hides it from you. So your mind does not get louder because you are failing. It gets louder because there is finally nothing left to numb it. And once you understand this, something inside you begins to soften. Because the struggle is no longer a mystery about who you are. It becomes a pattern you can finally see clearly. But there is something even deeper happening underneath this that most people never notice. And it explains why your thoughts feel so emotionally charged at night in ways they never do during the day. And what I am about to share next, nobody talks about this, but it changes everything. There is something about money that most people never question, even though it quietly shapes how they feel every single night before sleep. You were taught to think of money as numbers, work, effort, and outcomes. something outside of you, something you chase, something you either have or do not have. But there is a deeper layer almost nobody talks about. Money is not just physical, it is deeply emotional. It moves through belief, expectation, and the inner feeling you carry when no one is watching. Do not skip this part, because this is where most people make the biggest mistake. There is a lesser-known finding in behavioral psychology. People make their most emotionally driven decisions not when they are active and alert, but when their mind is tired and less guarded. That means the emotional state you fall asleep in is not just a reflection of your day. It becomes the background tone your mind uses to interpret tomorrow. So when someone falls asleep feeling pressure, lack, or fear about money, they are not just ending the day like that. They are imprinting that emotional state deeper than they realize. Most people fall asleep in scarcity energy without even noticing it. The quiet thoughts like "this is not enough, I need more," or "what if things do not work out," become the final emotional signature of the day. And here is where everything quietly shifts. Your last thought before sleep is not just a thought. It is a signal your subconscious accepts without resistance. It becomes the emotional instruction your mind continues to build from while you rest. That is why some people wake up feeling instantly behind before the day even begins. This is not about blame. This is about awareness. Because once you see this clearly, you start to realize something important. You are not just thinking about money, you are feeling your relationship with it constantly, especially in your most vulnerable state. And here is the gentle challenge to everything you are taught. If money responds so strongly to action, why does your emotional state in silence affect how your entire experience of money feels the next day? Maybe it is not only about effort. Maybe it is also about frequency. And once that idea enters your awareness, it becomes impossible to ignore the possibility that something much deeper is always shaping your financial reality in the background. And what comes next will show you why the final moments before sleep may be more powerful than anything you do during the entire day. And nobody is paying attention to it. There is a moment every night when your mind becomes more open than it is during any conversation, any decision, or any effort you make throughout the day. Right before sleep, something subtle happens inside you. The thinking mind begins to slow down, and the deeper part of you becomes more receptive. This is not imagination. This is how human cognition naturally shifts between active awareness and subconscious processing. Do not skip this part, because this is where most people make the biggest mistake. There is a lesser-known finding in sleep research showing that just before falling asleep, the brain enters a transitional state called the hypnagogic phase. In this state, the mind becomes highly suggestible, meaning thoughts and emotions are absorbed more deeply than during normal waking hours. This is the window where most people unknowingly download their reality, not through effort, not through logic, but through the emotional tone they hold in silence. And that is why this moment matters more than people realize. Because if the last emotional state before sleep is stress, pressure, or scarcity, the subconscious does not argue with it. It simply accepts it as familiar truth and begins organizing perception around it. But something very different begins to happen when that same moment is shifted. When a person gently settles into a feeling of safety, even without external proof, something in their internal world begins to reorganize. The mind starts filtering reality differently. Small things feel less threatening. Possibilities that were ignored begin to appear more visible. This is not magic, it is perception adjustment. And it creates a powerful shift, because you are not only changing how you think, you are changing how your mind interprets everything it sees. Here is the part most people overlook. The goal is not to force positivity. It is not to pretend everything is perfect. It is to allow the body and mind to experience a moment of emotional safety before sleep. Even if it is small, even if it is subtle. That single shift begins to interrupt the pattern of constant internal alarm. And over time, the mind stops preparing for danger and starts becoming open to stability. There is a reason this practice has been quietly used in different forms across meditation traditions, even without modern language to explain it. It is not about belief systems. It is about state. And once you understand that state is the starting point of perception, you begin to realize something powerful. You are not stuck inside your thoughts. You are the one shaping the emotional lens those thoughts pass through. But what happens next is where things become even more interesting, because there is a specific way this emotional state begins to influence the way your entire sense of reality responds over time. And what I am about to share next, nobody talks about this, but it changes everything. There is a strange habit the mind repeats every night, even when the body is exhausted and ready to rest. It tries to solve tomorrow. It goes over conversations that have not happened yet, problems that do not exist yet, outcomes that are not even real yet, as if thinking harder at night will somehow create control over something that has not arrived. Do not skip this part, because this is where most people make the biggest mistake. There is a lesser known insight from cognitive neuroscience. When the brain is deprived of rest, the prefrontal cortex becomes less efficient at regulating emotional prediction. In simple terms, the more tired you are, the more your mind confuses imagined future scenarios with immediate threats. That is why nighttime thinking feels so urgent. It is not clarity. It is emotional overload wearing the mask of problem solving. And here is where the struggle deepens. Because control feels safe in theory, but in practice it creates tension in the nervous system. The mind stays active, scanning, rehearsing, preparing, but the body cannot rest while it is in a state of constant mental preparation for outcomes that do not exist yet. That is the hidden blockage most people feel but cannot name. And maybe this is familiar in a way that feels uncomfortable. Lying down, physically tired but internally active, trying to figure it out before sleep, trying to reach a conclusion before rest is allowed. Here is the truth nobody says out loud. You were never broken. You were never lost. You were always exactly where you needed to be. You are simply trying to carry the weight of an entire future into a moment that was never meant to hold it. And this is where something important begins to shift. You do not solve tomorrow in bed tonight, because the more you try, the more you teach your mind that rest is not safe unless everything is resolved. And that creates a cycle where peace always feels conditional. But the moment you stop negotiating with the future in your mind, something unexpected happens. The nervous system begins to loosen its grip. The emotional noise starts to lose urgency. Not because problems are solved, but because the demand to solve them right now disappears. And in that space, something subtle begins to return. A sense that not everything needs to be carried at once. A sense that life continues even when you stop controlling it for a moment. And what you are about to discover next is why this release does something even deeper than calm the mind. It begins to change how you experience your entire sense of self over time. And what I am about to share next, nobody talks about this. But it changes everything. There is a shift that almost nobody notices, yet it changes the entire way a person experiences life, especially in the quiet moments before sleep. It is the moment when the mind stops asking, what is missing? And begins even briefly to feel, I am already here. Do not skip this part, because this is where most people make the biggest mistake. There is a lesser known finding in emotional neuroscience that shows the brain does not respond strongly to future rewards when the nervous system is already under stress. In simple terms, when you are tense, your mind becomes less able to feel satisfaction even when something good is present. That is why enough is not a number. It is a state, and most people have never actually experienced it fully, not because they do not have enough, but because their attention is always placed on what is still missing. But something changes when that attention softens, not when life becomes perfect, not when money suddenly appears, but when, for a brief moment, the internal pressure to fix everything stops. That is what already enough actually feels like. It is not excitement, it is not achievement, it is quiet. It feels like the mind no longer needs to run forward to prove safety. It feels like the body can finally rest without negotiating conditions for peace. And maybe you can sense how rare that feeling has become, because most nights are spent inside evaluation, measuring, comparing, calculating, trying to reach a version of life that feels acceptable before rest is allowed. Here is the truth nobody says out loud. You were never broken. You were never lost. You were always exactly where you needed to be. You were simply trained to believe that peace comes after everything is fixed, instead of noticing that peace can exist even while nothing has changed yet. And when that realization lands, something subtle begins to happen. The mind stops tightening around the future. The body stops bracing for lack. And there is a softening that cannot be forced. It feels like sitting down after carrying something heavy for too long without realizing how exhausted you were. And in that softness, a strange clarity appears, not about solving life, but about no longer fighting it in this exact moment. But what comes next is where this shift begins to take on a deeper form, because there is a simple inner practice that anchors this state in a way most people never discover. And what I am about to share next, nobody talks about this. But it changes everything. There is a quiet practice that changes everything, yet it has almost nothing to do with thinking and everything to do with feeling. Most people try to see money in their mind. They imagine numbers, bank accounts, or outcomes. But the real shift never happens there. It happens deeper. Do not skip this part, because this is where most people make the biggest mistake. There is a lesser-known principle in neuroscience called emotional encoding. It shows that the brain stores experiences more strongly based on how they feel, not what they look like. This means your nervous system does not respond to images as much as it responds to emotional safety or tension. So when you try to force positive thoughts while feeling anxious, the body does not believe the thought. It follows the feeling. And that is why this practice is not about imagination. It is about state. Now gently bring attention inward, not to money itself, but to what money is supposed to represent for you at the deepest level. Not numbers, not transactions, not outcomes. Security, breathing room, the feeling of not being under pressure, the feeling of not being chased by time or worry. At first there may be doubt. The mind may say this is too simple, too subtle, too unrealistic. That is normal. The mind is used to solving, not feeling. But stay with it, because beneath that doubt, something softer begins to appear when attention stops resisting. A slight ease in the chest, a loosening in the shoulders, a quiet sense that even if nothing has changed outside, something inside is no longer in fight mode. That is the beginning of recalibration. Here is the truth nobody says out loud. You were never broken. You were never lost. You were always exactly where you needed to be. And this is where the real shift begins. Not in forcing belief, but in allowing emotional familiarity with safety, even for a few moments at a time. Because repetition is not just habit. It is wiring. What you return to emotionally becomes what your nervous system learns to recognize as normal. So each time you enter this feeling, even briefly, you are not escaping reality. You are slowly teaching your system a new one. And what begins to happen next is subtle at first. So subtle that most people miss it completely, even when it starts shaping their daily reactions and decisions in ways they cannot explain. And what I am about to share next, nobody talks about this, but it changes everything. There is something happening while you sleep that most people completely misunderstand, even though it is happening to them every single night. It feels like nothing. It feels like absence. But beneath that silence, your mind is doing something far more important than thinking. It is reorganizing. Do not skip this part, because this is where most people make the biggest mistake. There is a well-documented finding in sleep science called memory consolidation. During deep sleep stages, the brain actively processes emotional experiences from the day, strengthens certain neural pathways, and reduces the emotional intensity of others. In simple terms, your mind is not off at night. It is integrating what you felt while awake. But this goes deeper than memory, because what gets integrated is not just events, it is emotional patterns. So if the dominant feeling before sleep is stress, lack, or pressure, the mind does not simply forget it. It absorbs the emotional tone and uses it as part of its ongoing internal map of reality. That is why the state you fall asleep in matters more than most people realize. And here is where the shift in perception begins. You are not just sleeping, you are aligning, not in a mystical sense that demands belief, but in a psychological sense where your internal state continues to organize itself even when conscious control is gone. And maybe this explains something you have felt before but never fully understood. Waking up with the same emotional weight you fell asleep with, even if nothing external changed. It is not coincidence, it is continuity. But here is the deeper truth. This process is not fixed. It is responsive, meaning the emotional tone you carry into sleep becomes part of what your mind considers familiar. And familiarity quietly shapes perception. It influences what you notice, how you interpret situations, and how safe or pressured life feels when you wake. Here is the truth nobody says out loud. You were never broken. You were never lost. You were always exactly where you needed to be. And once you see this clearly, sleep stops being an escape from life and becomes part of how life is internally structured and reorganized. So instead of trying to force control before bed, something softer becomes possible. Trusting that your system is always listening, always adjusting, always responding to the emotional frequency you settle into. And in that trust, something begins to loosen that most people carry for years without realizing it. But what happens next is even more subtle, because there is a way your mornings begin to reflect these internal shifts long before any external change becomes visible. And what I am about to share next, nobody talks about this, but it changes everything. There is a very quiet moment in the morning that most people overlook, even though it reveals more about change than anything else in the entire day. It is not a big event. It is not a dramatic transformation. It is something subtle, almost easy to miss unless you are paying attention. You wake up, and for a brief moment, the emotional weight you carried yesterday does not feel exactly the same. Do not skip this part, because this is where most people make the biggest mistake. There is a lesser-known principle in cognitive psychology called perceptual priming. It shows that the brain does not experience reality in a fixed way. Instead, it filters incoming information based on recent emotional and neural activity. In simple terms, your internal state subtly influences what feels important, threatening, or calm in your environment. This is why 2 mornings can feel completely different, even if nothing external has changed. And this is where the shift begins to show itself. Not in money appearing, not in circumstances changing, but in how life feels when it is the same life. You might notice a conversation that normally feels heavy does not hit as hard. A situation that usually triggers stress feels slightly more distant. A thought that used to spiral now passes through without pulling you into it. These are not coincidences, they are early signs of internal recalibration. And at first it can feel almost confusing because you expect change to be loud. You expect evidence to be obvious. But real transformation often begins as a difference in response, not in reality itself. Here is the truth nobody says out loud. You were never broken. You were never lost. You were always exactly where you needed to be. And that is why these small shifts matter more than they seem. Because they are the first visible reflection of an invisible change already happening within your system. A slight pause before reacting. A softer interpretation of the same thought. A moment where pressure does not escalate like it used to. That is how alignment begins to show itself. And if you stay aware of these subtle signs instead of dismissing them, something powerful happens. You stop measuring change only by external outcomes, and you start recognizing the internal rewiring that always comes first. And what you begin to realize next is that these small shifts are not random at all. They are pointing towards something much deeper that most people completely miss while waiting for big results to appear. And what I am about to share next, nobody talks about this, but it changes everything. There is something quietly beautiful about the fact that you are still here, still listening, still allowing these words to reach you in this moment of your night. Because this was never just about money. It was never just about sleep. It was about the state you carry when everything becomes quiet, and you are left alone with your thoughts, your worries, and your hopes for tomorrow. And slowly through this journey, something important has started to shift. At the beginning, there was tension. The feeling that your mind was too active, too loud, too difficult to control. Then came awareness, the understanding that your thoughts are not your enemy, they are simply overloaded. After that, something deeper opened. The realization that what you feel before sleep quietly shapes how you experience life itself. And now you are here in a softer place. Not because everything is solved, not because life suddenly changed, but because something inside you has started to loosen its grip. Before you go, read this one last thing carefully. This might be the most important thing in this entire video. You were never meant to carry all of tomorrow inside tonight. You were never meant to solve your entire life in a moment of exhaustion. And you were never meant to measure your worth by how much you are still trying to fix. Everything you just heard, you already knew. Deep inside, you just needed someone to remind you. That is all this ever was. A reminder that your mind does not need to be your enemy. That your nights do not need to be a battlefield. And that even in uncertainty, there is still space for calm to exist within you. Let this not become another thing you try to do perfectly. Let it become something softer than that. A return, a remembering, a quiet permission to stop forcing everything into place before you rest. Tonight, you do not need to solve everything. You only need to allow yourself to be here, breathing, present. Enough in this moment, even if nothing outside has changed yet. And if you return to this feeling again tomorrow, even for a few seconds, something subtle will continue to shift in ways you may not immediately notice, but will eventually recognize in how you feel, how you respond, and how life meets you. That is the real transformation. Not sudden, not loud, but steady. If this message brought you even a little peace, consider subscribing and liking the video. Not as a request, but as a way of staying connected to more reminders like this, whenever you need to come back to yourself again. Sleep now with less pressure on your mind. Let the night be what it was always meant to be. A place where you stop holding everything and simply begin to rest.